1943. Deep beneath the streets of London, a team of British engineers sat in a cramped workshop surrounded by what appeared to be ordinary chunks of coal. But these weren't fuel for keeping warm during the Blitz. These were weapons. Precision-engineered explosive devices designed to look so convincingly like standard Welsh anthracite that German railway workers would grab them with bare hands and toss them straight into locomotive fireboxes without the slightest hesitation. Within minutes of entering those flames, the fake coal would detonate with enough force to turn a pressurized steam boiler into a bomb, sending shrapnel through the engine cab and derailing Germany's entire logistics network one explosion at a time. The brilliance wasn't in the explosive power. It was in the deception. Every destroyed locomotive would look like a tragic accident, just another boiler failure in an overworked railway system. German investigators would find no evidence of sabotage, no traces of Allied involvement, nothing but twisted metal and the assumption that their equipment had simply failed under wartime stress. This was explosive coal, one of the most psychologically devastating weapons Britain ever created, and it turned every coal pile in Nazi-occupied Europe into a potential death trap. Before you continue, if you're finding this exploration of covert British warfare engineering fascinating, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone interested in the hidden weapons that changed World War II. It genuinely helps us continue producing this content, and ensures you won't miss the next deep dive into history's most ingenious military innovations. To understand why British intelligence invested enormous resources into fake coal, you need to grasp just how completely the German war machine ran on railways. By late 1942, Nazi Germany controlled a territory larger than the entire continental United States. From the Atlantic Wall fortifications on the French coast to the frozen steppes outside Stalingrad, from occupied Norway in the Arctic to North Africa's desert battlefields, every single ton of supplies moved primarily by rail. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, Germany's state railway system, operated over 200,000 miles of track across occupied Europe. This network moved everything. Panzer divisions traveling to the Eastern Front Road on flatbed railway cars. Artillery shells manufactured in the Ruhr Valley reached frontline positions via freight trains. Wounded soldiers came back on hospital cars. Soldiers on leave traveled home by passenger service. Food requisitioned from occupied territories flowed into Germany on the same tracks that carried coal out to power stations and factories. Without functioning railways, the entire German war economy would collapse within weeks. The problem for the Germans was simple mathematics. Railways consumed coal, and coal was the one resource Germany actually had in abundance. The Ruhr Valley alone produced over 100 million tons annually. Silesian mines added tens of millions more. Unlike petroleum, which Germany desperately lacked and had to synthesize at enormous cost or import from Romania, coal was everywhere. Every locomotive, every power station, every factory furnace burned coal. This dependency created a strategic vulnerability that British intelligence recognized immediately. Disrupt German coal supplies or destroy the locomotives that burned it, and you would paralyze their entire war effort. But targeting this vulnerability proved extraordinarily difficult. Bombing raids on coal mines achieved little. The mines were vast, difficult to destroy from the air, and could be repaired relatively quickly. Bombing locomotives in rail yards worked when you could get bombers through, but German air defenses shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft attempting such missions. Conventional sabotage by resistance fighters required getting explosives onto or under locomotives, which meant penetrating heavily guarded rail yards, planting charges, setting timers or fuses, and escaping before German security forces caught you. Hundreds of French, Belgian, Norwegian, and Polish resistance members died attempting exactly these operations. The risk-to-reward ratio was terrible. British intelligence needed something radically different. Something that required no specialized training, no dangerous infiltration of railway facilities, no escape plans. Something so simple that an ordinary civilian with access to a coal tender could deploy it. Something that would destroy locomotives from within, using Germany's own fuel supply as a delivery mechanism. The answer came from a network of secret research facilities scattered across the English countryside, all operating under the innocuous designation of Special Operations Executive Research Stations. These weren't military bases in any traditional sense. They were country houses, converted estates, and requisitioned properties where Britain's most creative engineers and craftsmen developed the tools of unconventional warfare. Station 12 at Aston House near Stevenage became the primary manufacturing hub. The facility had been relocated there from Bletchley Park in November 1940 after repeated complaints from code breakers working next door that the constant explosions and testing were making it impossible to concentrate on breaking German ciphers. Under the command of Colonel Leslie Wood, Station 12 transformed into Britain's most productive weapons factory for irregular warfare. By war's end, this single facility had manufactured over 12 million time pencil detonators, the ingenious chemical delay fuses that resistance fighters across Europe used to time their sabotage attacks. They produced more than 38,000 limpet mines for underwater sabotage. They developed incendiary devices, booby traps, and assassination weapons. But among their most sophisticated products, the ones that required the deepest understanding of both engineering and psychology, were explosive devices disguised as ordinary lumps of coal. The technical challenge was far more complex than it initially appeared. The device needed to be visually indistinguishable from real coal under casual inspection. Railway workers handled hundreds of coal chunks daily. They developed an instinctive sense for weight, texture, and appearance. Anything that looked slightly wrong would be discarded immediately. The fake coal also needed to survive rough handling. Real coal got thrown onto piles from considerable heights, shoveled into tenders with metal spades, and jostled against thousands of other lumps during transport. If the disguised explosive cracked open or showed seams, the deception would fail. Worse, if it detonated prematurely during handling, it would kill the resistance member carrying it and alert German security forces to the entire operation. The device also needed to function reliably under the specific conditions inside a locomotive firebox. Coal fires and steam locomotives burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The explosive had to detonate after sufficient heat exposure, but before the coal completely burned away. Timing mattered enormously. Detonate too quickly, and the firemen might survive and report sabotage. Detonate too slowly, and the explosive might burn harmlessly. The optimal window was roughly 5 to 15 minutes after entering the firebox, enough time for the locomotive to build steam and begin moving, far enough from the coal pile that no one would connect the explosion to sabotage. British engineers solved these requirements through brilliant materials science and manufacturing innovation. The explosive core consisted of approximately 1/4 pound of Nobel 808, a specialized plastic explosive developed by Nobel Chemicals Limited specifically for covert operations. Unlike traditional explosives, P808 was malleable, stable, and remarkably safe to handle. You could drop it, hit it with a hammer, or even shoot it with a rifle, and it wouldn't detonate without a proper detonator. This safety characteristic was essential for resistance operations. The explosive came in a greenish, plasticine-like consistency with a faint almond odor. Engineers paired it with a number 27 detonator and a heat-sensitive fuse calibrated to ignite at specific temperatures. The fuse was a critical component. It needed to be sensitive enough to trigger reliably in a firebox, but stable enough to survive summer heat in a coal pile. British chemists spent months perfecting the formulation, testing dozens of chemical compositions, until they found one that met both requirements. 1/4 pound of plastic explosive might not sound like much, but inside a locomotive, it was devastating. The primary explosion would rupture the boiler, and this is where the real destruction occurred. Steam locomotives operated with boilers pressurized to 200 to 250 pounds per square inch. That's roughly 15 times atmospheric pressure. When the explosive ruptured the boiler shell, all that superheated water instantly converted to steam, expanding with catastrophic force. The entire locomotive essentially became a bomb, tearing itself apart from the inside. Boiler fragments would shoot through the engine cab like shrapnel. The locomotive's frame would buckle and twist. In many cases, the explosion would be powerful enough to derail the entire train. The manufacturing process evolved through several iterations as engineers refined their techniques. The earliest method, developed in late 1940, involved drilling actual lumps of coal with a specialized 6-inch serrated tube. Engineers would carefully bore into the coal, creating a cavity large enough to hold the explosive charge and detonator. They would insert the P-808 and fuse assembly, then seal the hole using coal dust mixed with industrial adhesive. Arthur Christie, a laboratory assistant at Station 12, conducted many of these early experiments, painstakingly drilling individual coal lumps and documenting which techniques produced the most convincing results. The problem with this approach became apparent quickly. Coal is brittle and prone to fracturing. The drilling process frequently split the coal into pieces, ruining the entire device. Even when drilling succeeded, the structural integrity was compromised. The fake coal would sometimes break apart during normal handling, exposing the explosive core. Engineers needed a better solution. That solution came from Station 15 at the Thatched Barn in Borehamwood, a facility that represented one of the war's most unusual military organizations. Station 15 housed the Special Operations Executives Camouflage Section under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Elder Wills, a man whose pre-war career had been in film production as an art director. Wills understood that creating convincing fake coal wasn't primarily an engineering problem. It was a problem of theatrical props and special effects. He recruited over 300 workers from Britain's film industry, prop makers, set designers, sculptors, painters, and craftsmen who had spent their careers making fake objects look real on screen. Among these recruits was Wally Bull, a talented prop maker who would later work on Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Bull approached the fake coal problem with a filmmaker's eye for detail. Instead of modifying real coal, he would create coal from scratch using molds and casting techniques. His breakthrough was using dyed Herculite plaster as the primary material. Herculite was lightweight, easy to work with, and could be colored to match any coal type. Bull created two-part clamshell molds taken from actual coal specimens. He would place the explosive charge and detonator in one half of the mold, then pour liquid plaster around it. Once the plaster set, he would coat the entire surface with actual coal dust mixed with adhesive. The result was extraordinary. The fake coal had the correct weight, the right surface texture, and the irregular shape of natural coal. Most importantly, it was structurally sound. No more drilling-related fractures. No visible seams that might give away the deception. The final refinement came when engineers began encasing the explosive charge in thin metal casings before pouring the plaster. This created an additional barrier between the explosive and the plaster, eliminating any possibility of visible seams or joints where the two materials met. Production efficiency improved dramatically. Station 15 could now manufacture hundreds of explosive coal devices per week, each one individually crafted to match specific coal types. The attention to coal varieties was crucial because coal isn't uniform. Different mining regions produce coal with distinct appearances. Lignite, sometimes called brown coal, is the lowest grade, with a brownish color and relatively low energy content. Bituminous coal, the most common type used in locomotives, is black with a bright, almost glossy luster when freshly broken. Anthracite, the highest grade, is hard, dense, and shows a metallic sheen. SOE manufactured explosive coal in multiple varieties designed to match the specific coal types used in different regions of occupied Europe. If you were sabotaging locomotives in northern France that burned Welsh anthracite, you received black, hard fake coal. If you were targeting trains in Poland that used Silesian bituminous coal, you got a different version. This attention to regional detail significantly increased the weapon's effectiveness. Between 1941 and 1945, Station 12 and Station 15 together produced approximately 3.5 tons of explosive coal. Given that each device weighed roughly 1/4 pound, this represents somewhere between 6,000 and 14,000 individual weapons. That's a substantial arsenal, especially considering the manufacturing complexity involved. Each device was handcrafted, individually inspected, and tested to ensure reliability. Distribution relied on the Royal Air Force's Special Duty Squadrons based at RAF Tempsford in Bedfordshire. Number 138 Squadron and Number 161 Squadron flew Halifax, Stirling, and Lysander aircraft on supply missions across occupied Europe throughout the war. These were extraordinarily dangerous operations. Pilots flew at night, navigating by dead reckoning and primitive radio beacons, dropping supplies to resistance groups operating in German-controlled territory. German air defenses shot down hundreds of these aircraft. By war's end, these squadrons had completed over 13,500 sorties, delivering more than 10,000 tons of supplies to resistance networks in France, Belgium, Norway, Poland, Yugoslavia, Italy, Greece, and elsewhere. The French resistance received the largest allocation of explosive coal. France's position as the primary route for German supplies moving to and from the Atlantic Wall and the Mediterranean theater made French railways critical to German logistics. SOE sent 470 agents into France between 1941 and 1944, many of them tasked with organizing railway sabotage networks. Explosive coal was ideal for French resistance operations because it required minimal technical expertise. A railway worker sympathetic to the resistance, a farmer whose land bordered a railway line. Even a German conscripted laborer forced to work in a coal yard could deploy the weapon. All it required was access to a coal pile or tender and the ability to toss a single piece of fake coal onto a pile without being observed. Belgium, with its dense railway network connecting Germany to occupied France, received substantial shipments. Norwegian resistance groups received smaller quantities, given Norway's more limited rail infrastructure, but used them effectively against German supply lines running south from Arctic ports. Polish resistance networks received explosive coal for use against trains moving supplies to the Eastern Front. Yugoslav partisans under Josip Broz Tito found the weapon particularly valuable. Yugoslav resistance conducted constant attacks on the railway lines connecting Germany to Greece and the Balkans. German forces in Yugoslavia spent enormous resources guarding hundreds of miles of vulnerable track. Explosive coal gave partisan fighters another attack vector, one that required no direct confrontation with German guards. Here is where the historical record becomes frustratingly incomplete. Despite 3.5 tons manufactured, despite thousands of devices distributed across occupied Europe, despite multiple resistance networks receiving and deploying the weapon, documented records of specific explosive coal attacks are remarkably sparse. No operation reports named specific dates, locations, or locomotive casualties attributable to explosive coal. No German records describe discovering the devices. No post-war assessments quantify how many German locomotives were destroyed by this method. This absence of documentation requires explanation, and that explanation reveals why explosive coal was so effective as a psychological weapon. The entire point of the design was to leave no evidence of sabotage. When explosive coal worked as intended, the resulting explosion would appear identical to an accidental boiler failure. German investigators arriving at the wreck site would find a ruptured boiler, a destroyed locomotive, possibly dead crew members, and wreckage scattered across the tracks. They would see equipment failure, not enemy action. Boiler explosions were not uncommon in steam locomotives, particularly in wartime when maintenance standards declined and locomotives ran far longer between overhauls than peacetime schedules recommended. German railway administrators dealt with genuine accidental explosions regularly. A successful explosive coal attack would be historically invisible, categorized as an accident rather than sabotage, filed away in maintenance reports rather than security investigations. Many SOE records were also deliberately destroyed after the war. Britain's intelligence services had strict policies about disposing of operational files that might compromise ongoing intelligence methods or expose agents who had survived the war and returned to normal life in occupied countries. If those records contained details about explosive coal deployments, they were likely destroyed decades ago. The sheer scale of railway sabotage in occupied Europe also makes attribution impossible. The French resistance alone conducted over 1,800 locomotive attacks between June 1943 and May 1940 for using every available method. They cut air brake lines with hacksaws. They poured grinding compound into cylinder assemblies. They removed wheel bolts. They planted conventional explosives under locomotives. They derailed trains with track charges. They attacked rail yard with mortars and machine guns. Explosive coal was one weapon among dozens in an enormous campaign of railway destruction. Even if specific locomotives were destroyed by fake coal, sorting out which explosions were sabotage and which method was used would be nearly impossible from historical records. What we can document with certainty is the psychological and strategic impact. Once word spread through German security services that coal supplies might be contaminated with hidden explosives, Germany faced an impossible dilemma. They could accept random catastrophic explosions in locomotives, ships, power stations, and factory furnaces, or they could redeploy thousands of troops away from combat duties to guard coal supplies across all of occupied Europe. Neither option was acceptable. Accepting the risk meant that every locomotive crew climbed into their cab, knowing that this might be the day a boiler explosion killed them. Factory workers shoveling coal into furnaces wondered if the next shovelful contained a bomb. Ship crews loading coal bunkers in occupied ports had the same fear. This psychological pressure was cumulative and corrosive. It degraded morale, slowed operations as workers became more cautious, and created an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty. Guarding coal supplies meant withdrawing forces from an already desperately overstretched military. By 1943, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. They needed every available soldier on the Eastern Front facing Soviet offensives, in Italy resisting Allied advances, in France preparing for the expected invasion, in the Balkans fighting partisans, and manning air defenses against round-the-clock bombing. Pulling thousands of troops off those duties to guard coal piles in railway yards, ports, and factories across occupied Europe was a strategic nightmare. Yet the alternative was worse. The Germans understood the threat because they developed their own version of explosive coal, and they attempted to deploy it against Allied targets. In June 1942, Operation Pastorius landed 8 German Abwehr agents on American beaches, 4 on Long Island and 4 in Florida. These agents carried substantial quantities of equipment, including plastic explosives molded to resemble coal alongside TNT blocks, detonators, and timing devices. Their assigned targets included coal-fired power plants and railroad infrastructure across the eastern United States. The operation was a complete disaster. All 8 agents were captured within 2 weeks of landing. 2 of them, who had previously lived in the United States and had doubts about their mission, turned themselves in to the FBI immediately after landing. Their information led to the rapid capture of the other 6. 6 of the 8 were executed. The 2 who cooperated received prison sentences. Germany never attempted similar sabotage operations against the American mainland again, but the fact that they equipped agents with fake coal demonstrates that German intelligence recognized the weapon's potential value. The British double agent Eddie Chapman, codenamed Agent Zigzag by MI5, provided direct evidence of German explosive coal capabilities and their limitations. Chapman was a British criminal who had been recruited by German intelligence after being captured in the Channel Islands. He convinced the Germans he was willing to work for them, then immediately turned himself over to British intelligence upon returning to England. In March 1943, Chapman's Abwehr handlers gave him 2 German-manufactured coal bombs with instructions to sabotage the merchant ship city of Lancaster in the port of Liverpool. Chapman immediately handed the devices to the ship's captain, who passed them to MI5 for technical analysis. British explosives experts who examined the German coal bombs reported that German manufacturing techniques lagged significantly behind British innovations. The Germans were still using the drilling method that Britain had abandoned in 1941, hollowing out real coal lumps and filling them with explosives. These devices were more fragile, easier to detect, and less reliable than the molded Herculite designs coming out of Station 15. The fact that Germany's intelligence services were still using inferior methods while Britain had moved to sophisticated casting techniques demonstrates the technological gap in this particular area of covert warfare. American intelligence adopted explosive coal after learning about the British design. The Office of Strategic Services Research and Development Branch, led by Dr. Stanley Lovell, developed an American version codenamed Black Joe. The OSS design used a different explosive compound, a 60-40 mix of penolite rather than Nobel 808, but the basic concept and manufacturing approach closely followed the British model. The OSS went further in some respects, developing a specialized coal camouflage kit that contained paints, brushes, adhesives, and tools that would enable agents in the field to match fake coal to local varieties. This kit-based approach reflected American industrial thinking, standardization, and field customization rather than the British method of pre-manufacturing multiple varieties. Both organizations clearly believed the concept had significant value, even if the historical record struggles to document specific results. The broader railway sabotage campaign achieved devastating and well-documented results through combined effects of all methods employed. French resistance attacks reduced German rail traffic by 60% between March and June 1944, the critical months leading up to the D-Day invasion. In the 2 weeks immediately following the Normandy landings, resistance fighters conducted 486 separate attacks on French railway infrastructure, preventing German reinforcements from reaching invasion beaches quickly enough to make a difference. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed in southern France, required 17 days to travel from Montauban to Normandy, a journey that should have taken 3 days by rail. They arrived too late to affect the battle's outcome. In Yugoslavia, German military records describe maintaining railway operations as requiring what one general called enormous problems and heavy railroad security commitments. The Germans had to dedicate at least half of their armed forces in Yugoslavia to protecting railways, pulling those units away from anti-partisan operations. Assignment to railway security became so dangerous and so despised that German commanders used it as severe punishment for disciplinary problems. Whether explosive coal directly contributed significant numbers to these documented results matters less than whether it contributed to the overall climate of fear, uncertainty, and resource strain that characterized German occupation. Contemporary SOE documents emphasize that destroying locomotives specifically inflicted disproportionate damage compared to cutting tracks or damaging rails. Railway crews could repair damaged track sections in 24 to 48 hours using readily available materials and relatively unskilled labor. Destroyed locomotives required months of specialized factory work to replace. Germany's locomotive manufacturing capacity was limited and under constant pressure from bombing campaigns. Every locomotive destroyed, by whatever method, represented an irreplaceable loss that degraded German logistics immediately and permanently. The concept's influence extended well beyond 1945 and became foundational to post-war covert operations doctrine. CIA historical reviews from the Cold War era note that given the importance of coal to economies on both sides of the Iron Curtain, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, explosive coal may have featured in covert operations throughout the 1950s and 1960s, though evidence remains classified. The weapon pioneered what became standard doctrine for disguised explosive devices in unconventional warfare. The same principles that guided explosive coal development, concealment in everyday objects, psychological impact through uncertainty, deniability of sabotage, appeared in dozens of subsequent innovations. SOE developed dead rats stuffed with plastic explosive designed to be planted in factory furnaces and boiler rooms. They created explosive logs for use in occupied countries, where wood-burning locomotives were common. They developed landmines disguised as animal dung for placement along roads in North Africa and Italy. Modern improvised explosive devices concealed in everyday objects, from cell phones to beverage containers, trace their conceptual lineage directly to Station 15's innovations in camouflage and deception. The psychological principles remain unchanged. Make the threat invisible and ubiquitous, and you force your enemy to divert enormous resources to defend against attacks that may or may not be coming. Surviving examples of British explosive coal reside in several military and intelligence museums. The Imperial War Museum in London holds specimens from the original Station 12 and Station 15 production runs, along with 16mm test footage filmed by Cecil Clarke at Station 17, showing the devices being manufactured and tested. The International Spy Museum in Washington displays examples that came to the United States through OSS channels after the war. The Museum of World War II in Massachusetts includes British explosive coal in its extensive collection of covert warfare equipment. These artifacts provide physical evidence of the extraordinary craftsmanship involved. Examining them in person, knowing they are explosive devices, you still struggle to distinguish them from ordinary coal. The surface texture, the irregular shape, the weight distribution. Everything convinces your senses that you are looking at something nature created deep underground millions of years ago, rather than something British engineers molded in a workshop in 1943. 1943. Deep beneath the streets of London, a team of British engineers created a weapon so elegantly deceptive that its successes remain largely invisible to history. So psychologically devastating that Germany developed copies despite having no effective defense against the original. 3.5 tons of explosive coal manufactured with painstaking attention to detail. Between 6,000 and 14,000 individual devices distributed to resistance networks across occupied Europe through some of the war's most dangerous missions. An unknown but likely substantial number of locomotives destroyed in explosions that German investigators classified as equipment failures rather than Allied sabotage. SOE explosive coal represents unconventional warfare at its most sophisticated level. This was a weapon measured not in confirmed kills tallied on after-action reports, but in fear generated among enemy forces, in resources diverted from combat operations to guard coal supplies, in the fundamental uncertainty injected into every coal pile across Nazi-occupied territory. British engineers identified a vulnerability that others had not even recognized as a vulnerability. They understood that Germany's dependence on coal-fired railways created an opportunity for a specific type of attack, one that would be tactically invisible but strategically significant. And they executed that vision with a 1/4 pound of plastic explosive hidden inside molded plaster rocks, coated with coal dust that German soldiers shoveled into their own fireboxes without suspicion. That was British engineering at its most creative. That was special operations executive at its most effective. And that was how fake coal, handcrafted in converted country houses across the English countryside, helped destroy the Third Reich from the inside by turning Germany's own fuel supply into a weapon against them.